All right. So thank you very much for coming to see our presentation. We're going to be talking about medical science researchers writing for our English publication from Japan. I'm Theron Muller from Waseda University, and this is my research assistant.
I'm Salem. It's a pleasure to be here today co-presenting with Professor Thurn. Thank you for this opportunity.
So in case you missed it, if you scan that QR code on the screen, you should be able to see these slides, which are hosted on Google Slides. So here's your opportunity to scan the QR code before we go on to the next slide. We do have the QR code again after the references if you wanted to save the slides for your records. And we should also add that this work was supported by Japan Society for the Promotion of Science Kaken grant, and you can see the grant information on the screen. So first of all, I wanted to explicitly acknowledge that when we were going through the data and thinking about this presentation, my doctoral thesis supervisor, Teresa Lillis's student writing book kept coming back. And so our title, The Access Regulation and Desire, is borrowed from her from 2001. And so it was striking to us that some of the themes that she found with student, graduate, postgraduate writers were also being, postgraduate writers in the UK were also being reflected in the authors that we were talking to in the Japanese context. So I just wanted to kind of make that explicit here. We were directly linking our presentation theme to her 2001 book. So this is an outline of our presentation, and depending on time, we might cut the discussion a little bit short because we're not entirely clear if we have 15 minutes or 20 minutes for the presentation. So we're trying to time this recording to try to accommodate both of those. So jumping into our review, so Japanese higher education faculty are largely Japanese, largely male, largely educated in Japan, and largely educated at the same university that they work at. It's one of my favorite terms from the literature, academic inbreeding. And within that context, there are programs that are intended to increase international student numbers, and those programs face potential pastoral and academic support issues because you have people who aren't used to living in Japan and aren't used to Japanese being brought into Japan to live in Japan and to study at universities that don't necessarily have the support structures developed to support them to be successful in their studies. And that's one of the themes that we're going to explore in the presentation today. And so the next thing we wanted to talk about is the method of our research using author profiles, which are based on Lillis and Curry's scholar profiles, which are intended to give a sense of the authors and their priorities, interests, and experiences in writing for academic publication. The term author profile is what I used in my doctoral thesis to summarize authors' experiences of writing for publication. And this is an example author profile from my thesis. And you can see that there's some background information about where the person is from, how long they've been in Japan, and then some of their experiences of writing for publication in Japan, and some of the motivations for them to write for publication. We don't expect you to read the text on the screen, and I'm not going to read it for you. But if you're watching this on a video and you'd like to pause and read it, you're welcome to. Okay, so jumping into the methods for the research, we were interested in Japan-based medical pharmaceutical science researchers writing for publication. The overall research, the larger grant project, is looking at types of publication over time and how they change, and then analysis of authors, particularly young career experiences of writing and researching for publication. And the grant is, this is the final year of the 3-year grant. And the presentation today is focusing on that author's experiences part of the grant. And with that, I think I can hand it over to AILA to talk about the author profiles.
Yes, thank you, Professor Theron. So just as Professor Theron mentioned, we use the author profiles method to provide insights into the experience and practices of authors from diverse backgrounds in academic publications. So these profiles give a brief sense of the author and their priorities, interests, and experiences in writing for academic publication. And part of the investigation involves semi-structured interviews with 3 Japan-based authors about their knowledge production practices. After the interviews, we have created the interview transcriptions. And to ensure credibility, we have presented the profiles to the authors. Of course, for their review and their confirmation of accuracy. After that, text histories were collected to explore the process of text until publication. So we have collected that, including the drafts produced and the different people involved, like authors, reviewers, translators, and editors. And finally, we identified any issues in the author profiles to better understand their experiences and challenges. So moving to the next slide, now that we have outlined our methodology, let's explore the first author profile. So KG is an Egyptian postdoctoral researcher living in Japan for 10 years. He was recommended for postgraduate studies in Japan by a colleague already studying there. He pursued his PhD in neuroscience and obtained the scholarship, which greatly facilitated his research process. His laboratory consisted of over 20 members from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds, encompassing members from Japan, Singapore, China, Egypt, Korea, and Pakistan. So, of course, this created a collaborative and multilingual environment. And that, of course, also improved creativity and exchange of ideas from different perspectives. So in KG's lab, there is a multilingual secretary who helps navigate administrative tasks. And this allowed researchers to focus more on their work without worrying about any additional burdens. About KG's academic experience, he had a limited writing experience before starting his academic career, and he received academic writing training during his pre-master's courses in his home country, which provided as a foundation for his later development. So KG's lab provides supportive and encouraging environment where regular discussions, weekly journal clubs, and monthly progress report meetings are conducted in the lab. So these research activities have significantly contributed to his growth as a researcher and as a writer. So despite this training and ongoing activities in his environment, he still faced some challenges concerning the academic writing, which like the lack of formal instructions and academic writing lectures. And for KG to overcome these challenges, he often relied on previously published works for conventions and guidelines, and this practice known as textual borrowing, which helped him to learn the standard and expectations of academic writing. So we could say that KG's academic writing experience was largely a process of self-learning and adapting to the requirements of various journals over time. As for the next slide about KG's publication process, so concerning the manuscript and publication, his lab benefited from a significant support system. So all the manuscript and data were sent to a professional English editing team, and this team consisted of native English speakers with expertise in the neuroscience field, but they were not listed as co-authors on the paper. So their professor provided significant support for covering these editing costs. And it's important also to note that such resources may not be feasible for other labs. So this is all for KG's experience and the limitation of time. Now, Professor Theron will provide another perspective and will share MVs and GY experiences.
Okay, and so as Ala said, in the interests of time, KG, we went into a little bit more detail to give you an idea of some of the depth of the author's backgrounds that we explored. But for NV and GY, I'm going to try to gloss it and go just a little bit faster. So NV is a Southeast Asian scholar who completed her PhD program in a medical science subspecialty within Japan. She was a self-funded student, and she came to Japan with a professional background as a patient-facing healthcare provider, which included researching and writing materials related to clinical practice. Her experiences in the PhD program were that the department chair expected publication of at least one paper in a journal with an impact factor prior to graduation. She described the writing process as enjoyable. She felt that she was quite well prepared to do the writing in English for publication, although she also felt that she largely wrote her journal manuscript in isolation with very little supervisory support. However, when it came time to submit the manuscript to a journal, the department chair had to approve the manuscript, and part of that approval process ended up meaning that her experience was fraught and disappointing. So these are the challenges that NV felt she faced. She felt she was left largely to complete her research on her own. She faced pressure for gift authorship to other lab members who she felt weren't involved in the research. And she ultimately ended up needing to consult scientists outside Japan for both pastoral and technical guidance. And so I just wanted to give some evidence for that pressure to gift authorship to give you an idea of some of the issues that NV was facing within the lab. So this is a letter from her supervisor, or this is an email from her supervisor to her following her submitting a second version of a manuscript that she's hoping to submit to a journal. And I just want to highlight that line there, recommending adding somebody as a co-author of the manuscript. And so this is, the supervisor has seen the manuscript, made a few comments, she's incorporated those comments, and then this is kind of a second round of comments from the supervisor prior to submitting the manuscript. And there's this add this person as a co-author of the manuscript, which she felt was a request to gift authorship to this person because she felt that person hadn't been involved at all in the authorship of the manuscript. Okay, so next, GY is a Japanese assistant professor who got his doctorate from a top Japanese public university. And while in his doctoral studies, his lab moved to the US, and he moved to the US with his supervisor. His doctoral thesis was in English based on a published journal article. And the writing process during his doctoral studies was his supervisor would largely write the manuscript, and GUI would create the figures and do all of the analysis. Then they would have regular meetings to discuss the project of the research and the writing. And so he took an assistant professor position in 2008 at a Japanese university, moved to Japan, and had a second paper that was based on his PhD published after he was writing it before he started the position, but it ended up being published after he started in 2008. And so in his new position, he was told to discontinue his previous work and to end communications with his previous collaborators and start anew. And that didn't go very well for him. So when he came up for his 2014 contract review, his 2008 paper was the only first author paper he had published in this new position. And as he describes it, having that paper saved his job. And so from his perspective, his new professor doesn't offer support, assistance, or guidance. And his new professor's kind of perspective is publishable results should be presented to him, to the supervising professor, for dissemination. So how did GY react in this situation? He ended up pursuing research that he felt he could accomplish independently. He ultimately gained access to international collaborators who could assist with writing for publication, which resulted in a 2015 first authored paper. And GY says it had his professor was a co-author, although his GY's opinion was his supervising professor didn't contribute to the writing, data collection, or analysis. And then there was one critical incident that I kind of wanted to slip in because it's important to some of our findings, where GY was setting up to do some collaborative research with the researcher at a different Japan-based university. And so they needed interinstitutional intellectual property agreement. The collaborator's university's IP documentation was in English. And then when GY presented that English documentation to his university's administration, he was told, no, this needs to be in Japanese. And you need to do the Japanese, you need to do the translation. Okay, so now we're going to get into the results and discussion. And do I pass this back to you, Allah?
Yes, thank you, Professor Thurn. Yeah, so we have identified three themes through the lenses of access, regulation, and desire. In access, the importance of institutional resources and social support network to overall research success. As for regulation, the institutional policies and procedures can regulate the academic environment, and it can either support or can burden researchers based on their flexibility and the support they offer. And finally, desire and the motivation for personal and professional growth that can drive researchers to engage in language learning and collaborative experiences, and eventually contributing to their overall success in the global academic community. Moving to the next slide, in limitation of time, also we have combined access and regulation together. So access can be through language support, such as multilingual secretarial support, like in KG's lab, and language classes for international students, also like KG's experience. As for the funding for publication, like the scholarship, author editors fees, and open access publishing fees, these are opportunities to support the involvement in research activities. However, access can be regulated by local lab expectations. So these expectations regarding authorships and data ownership can vary by lab and may impact access to support, like in GY's case. The inflexible language policies may not adapt to the needs of international researchers, as highlighted also in GY's critical incident. And some expectations are often understood implicitly until they are not followed. At this point, they become explicitly addressed, like GY's case that Professor Theron elaborated on. And concerning desire, Professor Theron will continue from here.
No, okay. So in terms of desire, all three authors wanted to try to engage with the global academic research community. There was also a desire for collegial collaboration, which local forces could facilitate in KG's case or disrupt in NV and GY's cases. Fulfilled desires led to feelings of success. That was largely KG's story. And then unfulfilled desires led to feelings of estrangement and cutting of connections with labs, which is ultimately what happened with NV and GY. And what we wanted to do next was we wanted to kind of explore some of the themes raised by the research that we presented to you today. I think one thing that we didn't explicitly investigate, but that I think certainly underlies the experiences of these three authors is gender. In NV's case in particular, I think as a Southeast Asian living in Japan, there were certain assumptions made by many of the more senior academics that she interacted with that ended up putting additional roadblocks in her way toward being a successful researcher that KG, a male from Egypt, didn't necessarily face. The second point is the authors coming from relatively more or less resourced backgrounds may also influence their impression of their time in Japan. In particular, I think KG had access to more resources in Japan than he otherwise would have in Egypt. And so that may have flavored his impression of the research environment in Japan. Whereas I think NV was on the opposite end of the spectrum, feeling like she had given up access to a lot of things in order to come to Japan. And so that ended up, I think, to a certain extent, flavoring her impressions of the research environment in Japan. And then for the third bullet, I think it's back to Allah.
Yes, so As we mentioned in KG's experience, that journal clubs and monthly progress reports, access to professional editing services, international lab members of the same nationality, professor grants and research funding that facilitate access to professional services and other opportunities, all of these together can contribute to a supportive research environment as demonstrated by KG's positive experience. And by integrating these aspects, institutions can enhance the overall research experience and the overall success of the researchers. So Professor Thurn will continue from here.
Okay, so we've passed the 20-minute mark, but just really quickly to wrap up. So regarding institutional support, it was largely lab-based, which in KG's case worked out fine. But when the lab was dysfunctional or had some problems, or the individual had problems within the lab, having everything based on the lab meant that they ended up not being able to access the support they need. And then also local expectations ended up trumping kind of more global standards in terms of decisions about authorship, what is ethical research, and then ideas about who owns research. And so let me just I had some examples we wanted to go through, but I'll pass those to our references, which are here. And then there's a link to the slides on Google Slides if you'd like to access them. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much.